Okay, so we are live. Adam, thank you very, very, very much for coming on to talk about the Sean Combs trial. I'm really glad you reached out to me, not least because there are many, many aspects of this that I'm interested in for all sorts of reasons. I think I'm about to write a book that may involve the defense team here. But for the purposes of today, what I think is so interesting to break down is what this trial is really about, okay? Because we've all read the headlines, we've all read that Cassie Ventura got up in the witness stand last week and said some really, really upsetting things when she described her years, almost 20 years long, right, relationship with Sean Combs. But that by itself is not what's at stake here, right? Can you
Right.
walk us through? I think it'd be why the government has brought a RICO charge along with the sex trafficking charge. Why did they not bring charges of domestic violence, which Sean Combs' defense has copped to? I mean, yeah, walk us through that.
Right. Well, it would not be a federal case. The defense attorney said we would not be here if this were a domestic violence case. We wouldn't be in the Southern District of New York over assaults that took place in Los Angeles. But the reason I reached out to you, Vicky, and why I thought this would be a great place for this conversation is you know more than anyone about in your coverage of Jeffrey Epstein, when it takes an entire enterprise, by which I
Right.
mean, now this is, I want to, the viewers who are watching now, this was the first line said by the prosecution in this case. Said, this is Sean Combs. To the public, he was Puff Daddy or Diddy, a cultural icon, a businessman larger than life. But there was another side of him, the side that ran a criminal enterprise. And that's what this case, that's what the prosecution has to prove. And what this case challenges us to do, and what the Jeffrey Epstein case challenges us to do, is think in systems. Because this
Mm.
was not said to be an isolated case of abuse. This wasn't said to be uh, what happens in what happened in a hotel in Los Angeles. That shocking footage that everyone saw of Sean Combs grabbing Cassie Ventura by the hair and dragging her into another room. If that were what this case was about, this case could not be charged. It wouldn't be a grand jury. What the case is about is the allegation of an enterprise that once you have this wealth and power, you can marshal that to take all of your assistance, all of all the trappings that come with it. When that video is captured on a surveillance footage, you can attempt to bribe the security guard, as is alleged in this case. And we had a security guard testify to that. There are records showing that. If someone threatens to expose you, or if there is jealousy, you can threaten to firebomb that person's car. So to take a step back here, racketeering, you first need to have a criminal enterprise that is together on a shared scheme, and then you need to go from there to have two racketeering acts. One of the acts in this case is arson. Another of
Mm.
the acts of this case is bribery. There are allegations of blackmail. One of the things that Cassie Ventura said throughout her testimony, and we saw text messages showing this, that if she walked out or told anyone that the sex tapes that she says she was coerced into making, to that she was essentially a young artist whose entire career was in Sean Combs's hands. That there was she did testify that she loved him a number of times, so there was that there. But there was also this vast power imbalance,
Mm.
and that this was used against her to keep doing the freak offs. That's what she testified to. And so to prove this case, and it's going to be an 8-week case, the prosecution needs to show that this was a system. This wasn't just Cassie Ventura. This is what happens when wealth and power come together and create systems to exploit people and to cover it up using bribery, brutality. That this was not said to be isolated incidents with one person. As a matter of fact, if you look at the civil litigation, there are more than 100 filed. We could talk
Mm.
about Jeffrey
I
Epstein.
Yes. So I think it's important for people to understand how this came about, why we're even at a criminal trial, because the parallels with Jeffrey Epstein, you're right, Adam, are really striking. Because in both cases, you had a vast, scaled up system. And in both cases, it took years to get to a criminal trial. And in both cases, it basically took civil litigation by one person. In Jeffrey Epstein's case, I would argue that it was the civil litigation that between Ghislaine Maxwell and Virginia Giuffre that
Correct.
wound up being the backbone of certainly of the government's case against Ghislaine Maxwell, but also I'm sure they would have used evidence in that against Jeffrey Epstein. We'll never know because obviously he died before he faced trial. And we can also talk about the fact that Dan Bongino last night said that he definitely committed suicide,
Mhm.
which was interesting. But I think it's important. I mean, I know less about what happened in the Sean Combs case, other than Cassie Ventura, after years and years of abuse, and she was out of her relationship with Sean Combs by the time she brought her civil litigation against him. What walk us through what happened there and how the feds then picked up the baton.
Well, she pretty much opened up the dam with her civil lawsuit. Cassie Ventura was the first to file. I think you're absolutely right with the parallel that you drew with Jeffrey Epstein. It was Virginia Giuffre that got the ball rolling and called attention to the larger nature of this. It was after Cassie Ventura in the Sean Combs case that dozens and then hundreds of other allegations came forward. Now, if you look at both cases, we both sat through the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell. And Ghislaine Maxwell, her defense was, oh, these are all people seeking a quick buck, that this isn't evidence of anything. There wasn't a finding of liability. They're making the same
Yeah.
defense in this case, that this is just the victims looking for a quick payday. And that is what they're running with. During the cross-examination of Cassie Ventura, the nature of the settlement came out. It was previously confidential. $20 million within one day. He went out to pay $20 million to quickly kind of sweep it under the rug, but under the rug refused to stay swept. So
Mm.
there was a so there's that parallel here. There's also I keep coming back, and it's why I reach out and why I really admire so much of your work. When you came out with The Talented Mr. Epstein, you looked at the whole system there. There was, you went deep into the SEC records
Yeah.
and the relationship with Les Wexner that people weren't talking about until years later, where it was, what is this weird financial arrangement where Jeffrey Epstein is controlling so much of a billionaire's fortune.
Yeah.
And it's, take it beyond the celebrity headlines, the bold-faced names, the cultural icons. What is being alleged here and what's being brought, I want to, in my reporting of this, kind of challenge folks to think in systems and what does this mean? Why are we having a Sean Combs racketeering trial and a sex trafficking trial after an R. Kelly racketeering trial and sex trafficking trial? What does that say about domestic abuse? What does that say of how we conceive of human trafficking? What do human trafficking groups think of that? We've been reaching out, hopefully, find out a little bit more from civil society how this changes or not changes the work they do. Who do we conceive of as human trafficking victims, and how is the law being used in order to confront these issues?
Well, so walk me through, Adam, because what obviously one big difference between the Epstein and Maxwell trials and this one is the age of
Absolutely.
the victims. And um, you know, when you're talking about girls, children, I think that that's very, very clear cut. And you're right. You know, her defense lawyers, they talked, I think, about the three M's: money, memory, manipulation, and the sort of on cross examination, these women were not just questioned about the money that they might stand to gain, but the fact that, you know, what had happened to them in some cases had happened so long ago, back in the 1990s, that their memory must have been manipulated by the money they could see at the end of the, you know, that was what it was all
Right.
about. And in this case, you are dealing with adults, and so there is a difference, because part of the reason, I mean, Jeffrey Epstein built an empire. Yes, it was money. It
Right.
was the men, Leslie Wexner and other men, paid Jeffrey Epstein for whatever reason. There's still a big question mark over that. You know, we know that Leon Black paid him $180 million for tax advice, he has
Right.
said. But Jeffrey Epstein was so wealthy that he could hide in his mansions and on his private island. And then the way he built a child sex abuse trafficking scheme was to, you know, to when he and Ghislaine Maxwell lured in women like the late Virginia Giuffre, who was then underage, she was then persuaded to go out and recruit other underage girls. And it became a sick, self fulfilling um, system. How was Sean Coombs's system? It was a little different, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's when the differentiating factor is age. The coercion is clear when you're talking about minors and you're talking about recruitment in high schools, and what prosecutors called a pyramid scheme of sexual abuse, where he would pay these high school students to give him sexualized massages and give them money to find other victims. The coercion could not be more clear cut.
Right.
In this case, one of the key defenses by Combs's defense lawyer, Tenny Garagos, one of the things that she said over and over again during opening statements, uh, talking about the women here as grown adult strong women. That was her refrain. And what we see right now, we're still very early in the trial, there are other manners of coercion. If you are being threatened with the release of compromising videos, if you step out of line, that's coercion. We've heard testimony from escorts. Now, one of the charges is traveling for prostitution, that these freak-offs relied on payments, repeated payments of male escorts who sometimes witnesses these horrific episodes of abuse and testified to that on the witness stand. And why didn't they tell anyone? One of them testified that he thought he would wind up dead. That was a
Mhm.
person's power. And we see again and again people fearing for their lives, people fearing for their reputations, being pushed into compromising situations, and having those compromising situations used against them through video blackmail, and this wasn't just one person. Now, to put this into perspective, it was routine from these freak offs that there would be a trail. Sorry to get graphic here, but sometimes of blood and urine. So
Mm.
this relied on people who saw that, who saw that, not saying anything because, oh, that's Sean Combs. For the companies that have perpetually employed these escorts to go for these string of freak offs, not just with Cassie Ventura. She was a star witness, and they started off right with the
Yeah.
star witness, but there are going to be other women testifying that this happened to them in the exact same manner. Dark hotel rooms, the same. I think the name of the company was Cowboys for Princesses, this escort service. So when you start talking about systems of how to allegedly cover up domestic abuse on a serial scale. And domestic abuse might, the defense claim about this is, well, sure, it's a crime, but it's not a federal crime, and it's not going to be prosecuted here, and it's not charged in this case. But if the domestic abuse is in service of the larger coercion, that's the heart of the prosecution's case, that domestic abuse was one of the tools, the violence was one of the tools to perpetuate a system of abuse. And so that's why, when I wrote this story for All Res News, the title was Criminal Enterprise, what the Diddy trial is really about, because, there's going to be a lot of headlines, many of them graphic, many of them wrenching, many of them emotional. But let's think of the bigger picture here, where it's kind of a socially useful phenomenon. There's tremendous interest in this case. We see it every day. How are uh, how's civil society adapting to that? How are domestic abuse organizations adapting to that? How is human trafficking advocacy adapting to the massive public interest that you see not only in the headlines, not only the in the broadcasts, but outside and inside the courtroom? It's one of those cases where you walk by 500 Pearl Street, which is the address for a federal
Mhm.
court. You see this flurry of activity. Many of them journalists, many of them protesters, some of them Puff Daddy supporters. And this is when cases like this come, it's a tremendous educational opportunity about our legal system. And then it becomes even more important to remind people what's actually at issue in the case. What is the
Right.
case about, and what is it not about? And the more detailed you get, I think, particularly with this case, the more illuminating it becomes. I sat in on a part of the R. Kelly trial, and that too, same allegations: racketeering, sex trafficking, and in that case, I believe there are also allegations of minors as well, but in the flurry of his prosecutions. Um, Now, with the Brooklyn case, though, in particular with R. Kelly, it became a question of, and the jury found him guilty there. It was a question of how he how his entire company got involved in the cover up of the exploitation.
Right.
And that's what's being alleged here. And who knows whether this case would happen if not for R. Kelly being prosecuted and convicted, if not for the Second Circuit, which is a federal appeals court right next to where this trial is taking place, saying, yes, this too can be racketeering and sex trafficking. And now this being legally established as a possible avenue, that there's nothing, at least legally, the jury will be the finder of fact, but legally, this is something we've seen before. So I wanted, as much as possible, in my reporting on this, to focus on the real heart of it.
And let me ask you this. I mean, two things, Adam. So one, it's fascinating that obviously, I mean, what Diddy or Sean Combs did to compromise to stop people from coming forward was film them, right?
Right.
Um, and of course, one of the things about Jeffrey Epstein was always this suggestion of video. It was never produced at anyone's trial, and that remains one of those highly speculated things that he filmed victims and had that over them, and he filmed men, but it was never proven. Whereas this, it's concrete, right?
Right. Well, the jury is going to privately see some of it because it is now evidence and important evidence that's going to be treated very carefully because of the sensitive nature about it. But yeah, no, it's absolutely evidence because, again, this isn't the existence of the video is cited by the prosecution as evidence of blackmail, as evidence of something to be used for humiliation and control. So it's a very important piece of evidence. And you're right, it's an enduring mystery in the Jeffrey Epstein case that there was a recovery of so much footage during the raid. And it's an enduring mystery what that was all about. And there's certainly a lot of very even convincing theories about it,
Right.
but it has not been brought up in court. And one can see why. The only time that we got justice for in the Jeffrey Epstein scandal was with the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell,
Yeah.
and so it'd be very hard to introduce something like that. I don't see how it would have come up with this prosecution.
Right. And then talk to me. I mean, the other thing. I mean, obviously, the reason at the end of the day, Ghislaine Maxwell was tried. After Jeffrey Epstein died, is that it's very hard for one person alone to keep the pyramid scheme going. And so, other than the victims, who here are we likely to hear from who sort of enabled it? I mean, it is household staff, right?
Right.
And security. And what is their argument for why do, what do they say was the mechanism by which Sean Combs controlled them, made them do what they did?
Right. Well, we don't need to predict. We've seen some already. We've seen an escort who was one of the people called for the freak off with Cassie Ventura, who testified that he witnessed domestic abuse. And he's not going to be the only one. What they promised that they would I would not be surprised at all if the prosecution calls as this goes on and trial is going on, even as we speak. They are likely to call people involved with his business. He's the person technically the person who testified said that he is not an escort. He is a stripper, and it evolved into escorts. Chances are there's going to be other stories of people who were called as escorts. There are going to be other people who ran hotel security. I would imagine we will hear from Jane, who is another key woman who stepped forward. Unlike Cassie Ventura, who is a very well known person, came forward in her real name. Other women are being called anonymously. We saw that in the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. That is going to happen again here. So it's supposed to be an 8-week trial. We're in week 2 of it. And that's, not including there's also the defense case and closing statements, closing arguments, all wrapped up in there. So I suspect we're going to hear from people at one of the folks watching noted most people will never come forward to protect others. That's absolutely true. There are the people who step forward. We will see how many have agreed to testify voluntarily, how many have
Right.
come by subpoena. There's a lot more to come. It's been just 1 week, and already what we've seen has been wrenching, devastating. One thing I don't think we even mentioned, Cassie Ventura. Talk about toughness. She was more than 8 weeks pregnant. No, excuse me, 8 months pregnant.
Months. Yeah, I was going to say.
Months,
Yeah.
months pregnant at the time of her testimony. And they wanted to wrap up her testimony very quickly last week because of that can't drag this out any longer. That she was talking about a very long period of very horrendous memories, and talking about all of that, facing tough questioning. So that is something that that's just something from the background of last week, and there's certainly going to be more women coming forward.
And what do we know about, have there been other, I mean, we know that he paid, there was a settlement of $20 million between him
Yes.
and Cassie Ventura. Were there other settlements to other women?
You know, the Washington Post has a really comprehensive catalog of all of the cases and their dispositions right now. I'm not actually sure about the number of settlements, but I'll recommend to folks, and I'll share the link with you. It lays them all out, and it's actually quite astonishing when you see the sheer number. And again, there are differences between the cases. I don't want to draw the
No.
parallels too neatly, but we saw that in Jeffrey Epstein. We saw that in the Jeffrey Epstein Compensation Fund. That it's a trickle and then a flood, and that's what happened here. It started with uh, a case filed by Cassie Ventura that lasted all of a day before being settled, and then once one person stepped forward in that manner, it all unleashed a flood of women stepping forward, men stepping forward. That and The Washington Post, I need to praise them here. They have a really comprehensive and illustrative breakdown.
What's, I think, quite sobering, Adam, and I don't know the answer to this, and you may not know the answer to this, is that if Sean Combs had settled the civil suit quicker and that it had never been made public, right?
Right.
Would this federal case exist?
Possibly not. I mean,
You know?
it shows the power of using the judicial branch of our system in making things that were allegations that were long hidden finally bubble up to the surface. Because a detail I always like to call attention to, the allegations in this case, the definition of the racketeering scheme here is that it lasted 20 years. That's the allegation.
Yeah.
And how long ago did Cassie Ventura file her civil suit? And we saw that video a year ago. Uh, this that puts it into casts it into stark relief. We're going to be seeing a timeline here because they're going to need to prove that time. They're going to show that timeline to the jury.
Yeah.
That's why it's alleged in the indictment.
Well,
Um,
I think it's fascinating because when I think back to the parallels with Jeffrey Epstein, so the Virginia Giuffre Ghislaine Maxwell civil suit, which remember was not, it was a defamation suit
Correct.
because Ghislaine Maxwell had publicly called Virginia Giuffre a liar. So that was the only reason that there was really any litigation between them at all, and it was sealed.
Right.
And the only and what happened behind the scenes was that Virginia Giuffre's lawyer, David Boies, went knocking and knocking and knocking on the door of the Southern District of New York, saying you really need to look at this. And I think he came up empty, but it was then that that Julie Brown at the
Right.
Miami Herald then really started to re-report the travesty of justice that had happened around Jeffrey Epstein over a decade earlier, when the FBI had got a case against him and it was completely nulled, and he ended up facing state charges and a slap on the wrist essentially. So I think I think to your point, it does seem that there's now, after R. Kelly, a precedent,
Mhm.
which is hugely important. But it still seems that for the government to go after these massive, alleged enterprises, you have to have somebody who's prepared. What there has to be someone who's prepared to go public.
Right. There has to be someone who's prepared to go public. And in both of these cases, and maybe it doesn't have to be through this mechanism, but it shows the power of the judiciary. These were the power of two lawsuits and people attaching their names to these lawsuits to give it public attention. You had mentioned the Julie K. Brown, her watershed coverage with perversion of justice, that exposed so much of the actions by the federal government, including Trump's then Secretary of Labor, Alex Acosta.
Trusted.
Uh, and so it takes these first lawsuits in both of these cases were a loud shot across the bow. So that's how it has panned out. In that there was civil litigation in the R. Kelly case as well, and now that these are not so much novelties, I think it's now very well established that this is how federal prosecutors are dealing with allegations like these. It'll be interesting to see how the public adapts to that, how civil society adapts to that, how we conceive of these issues fundamentally.
And also, I mean, and so what do you expect Sean Combs's defense team um, to do? I mean, you talked about the money, right? Um, and I remember in the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, one of the things her defense tried to do was, you know, when the FBI interview people, they keep notes. And one of the things the defense tried to do, obviously ultimately unsuccessfully, was use what some of the victims had said in their first interview before the existence of an Epstein compensation fund, and then sort of try to compare it with what they'd said in their third interview. Now, ultimately, the prosecution successfully pointed out that, you know, memories are not perfect, but that the central tenet of what these victims had said in time, you know, again and again and again, was the same thing. They may have misremembered dates or, you know, details, but they didn't remember the central theme of what they were saying. But what will this defense do, do you think?
What we've seen already is emphasizing the nature of adult, strong women. That was a refrain of the opening statements. They're going to try to dispute coercion. They're going to go after the racketeering acts alleged in the indictment very hard. And here's what I mean by that. The bribery allegation is very damaging because you have it in a police report that Combs tried to bribe me. It couldn't be more black and white. It is described there. It is testified to by a witness. And so the defense there is, you could see it in the questioning, where on cross examination, the attorney seemed to be suggesting that the money might have been because Combs was so violent that there was so much damage to the room, he was handing him $100,000 for the damage. That wasn't a bribe. You didn't know what it was for.
I see.
Um, he didn't say it outright, but if you listen very closely to the tenor of the questioning, it was your interpretation that it was a bribe, right? And you had mentioned that there was damage to the room. If folks are interested, there are photos of the damage to this room. I publish them on All Rise News. I'm sure they're floating around all over the place. The claim in the defense here is that just as they're turning the domestic violence, they're admitting to that, and it's a defense, and saying, "Oh, you charged the wrong crime. This should be somewhere in a state court." They're saying, "No, no, that $100,000 was because he trashed the place." Uh, they're going to go after the racketeering acts. They're going to go after, another one is the alleged threat to firebomb the
Right.
car of one of his romantic rivals. We'll see how they get at those very specific things. The blackmail relies on the tapes that they're going to say was consensually recorded. This wasn't for the purposes of blackmail. It's going to be very hard to attack that when you see the threat of the exposure of these videos right there in the text messages, right there in the text
Right.
messages. But that's what it's going to be. That this was that this they were swingers in in the words
Yeah.
of the defense attorney, and very thoroughly denied by Cassie Ventura on the witness stand. She said she never did another freak off before or after. Um, uh, that they're going to say that this is a prosecution of private sexual choices because they're denying coercion. But what we're seeing already is we're seeing all of the evidence of coercion from text messages, from the testimony, a very gripping testimony where, one of the things about Cassie Ventura as a witness, she could be, uh, very quiet and matter of fact, but these are chilling emotional accounts that she's
Yeah.
telling. And every now and then, she there are moments. I remember one moment where she cried on the witness stand, and it was after describing all of this terrible stuff. She was asked, "Was there anything that you liked about the freak offs?" She was asked that by the prosecutor. Said, "The time I got to spend with Sean." And that had a kind of ring of truth.
Wow.
She started getting choked up after that. It had the ring of truth because it was it seemed to the emotion seemed to pop up to her involuntarily, and it was this sort of it's the tender things that make you emotional, that she was able to recount all of these horrific things that she testified about, that she said she was coerced to do. And that one moment that made her weep was all of that made her feel worthless. And it was the memory of being like, it's the memory of being of aware that she was worth more.
Yeah.
That was the thing that struck her. So I think there's that not quantifiable stuff. I've been talking a lot about the evidence and whatnot,
Mm.
but the jury will ultimately need to make a determination. Who do you believe?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Because I remember to your, everything we're talking about at the end of the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, it was very simple. Did you believe Jane? Did you believe that at age, I mean, I'm misremembering the details, but at age 16, she went in a plane across state lines? Because that, if you believed her, that was sex trafficking.
Correct.
And do you believe Caroline? Do you believe she was sent a gift again across state lines? And I don't know that when we were listening to the testimony, nobody was listening for the crossing the state lines. What the jury was listening for was whether or not they believed the person
Correct.
on the stand. And
Right.
then it's only when they come to do the charging that they break it down like this. And that's when I hope, well, Adam, I hope we'll be talking about this long before we get to that point. But it is, I think we should try and, if we can, do a weekly update
Oh, that would
of
be lovely.
I,
Yeah.
I think we should do, because it's going to be, there now this week, we're, I think, going to see the prosecution's case for showing the enterprise, because it's a lot of the employees, Sean Coombs's former employees, are coming forward, I think, this week
Right.
to testify, or whether they've been subpoenaed or voluntarily. We'll soon find out.
Absolutely. And
Um,
yeah.
yeah.
And
So
I'm actually right after our conversation heading off to court, so
of course you are.
I'll be ready to give you an update soon. This has been very enjoyable, and I like
I
the kind of substance that you know, uh, given both of our professional
Yeah.
backgrounds, I think that we look at this from a kind of wide lens and the kind of big picture, and I think that's very important because there's just a daily headlines and the shocking thing of the day, but there's some serious stuff here that really matters to how we as a society deal with, in this case, admitted exploitation, right? At minimum, we're talking about domestic abuse.
Yeah.
And as the prosecution presents it with some powerful evidence to date, what we're talking about is a mass system of exploitation and cover up.
Fascinating. Adam, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll do this again next week.
Sounds good.
And all my viewers come back at 5 o'clock. So we're going to completely switch gears and talk about the British royal family. Adam, good luck in court today.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye bye.